Hey guys, tonight we begin with the hidden rules inside a medieval castle. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The first sound is faint but unmistakable. Iron-shod boots echoing across a stone corridor at dawn. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls a slow, deliberate sound that ripples through the thick walls of the medieval castle. A few moments later, the courtyard stirs awake. Servants hurry with buckets of water drawn from the well. Stable boys whisper to restless horses, and the sleepy cook tosses open the shutters of the kitchen, releasing the lingering smoke from last night's fire. It is a new day inside the castle, but every movement, every breath, follows a pattern, rules as ancient and rigid as the stones themselves. Life within these walls was never as free as it might appear from the outside. A castle was a world enclosed, built not just to withstand siege, but to contain order. And inside it, every man and woman knew their place. To live here was to live under an invisible, code-unspoken yet absolute system that governed not just what one could do, but how one must think, speak, eat, and even pray. These were the hidden rules of medieval castle life. If you were a nobleman, you were the embodiment of power, but not even you were truly free. From the moment you rose in your grand bedchamber, you were watched. Your attendants, carefully chosen for loyalty and silence, were expected to anticipate your every need, yet even they followed a strict order. The valet never overstepped the chamberlain, and the chamberlain answered only to the Lord himself. The hierarchy was everything, and to step out of it was to risk more than just dismissal. It could mean disgrace. Down below, in the servants' quarters, life began much earlier. The first rule was simple: never let the Lord see you idle. At sunrise, the great hall must already gleam. Tapestries were shaken free of dust, rushes swept from the floor, and candles trimmed to perfection. Even the air had to be right. The faint scent of herbs burned to mask the mustiness of stone. To the lord and lady, it was a sign of order. To the servants, it was survival. For one careless mark on a goblet or a misplaced cushion could invite the wrath of the steward, who wielded more authority in the castle than most knights. Meals, to obeyed a labyrinth of rules. When the great bell signaled the first meal of the day, everyone assembled by rank. No servant dared to sit before their superior. No dish was touched before the blessing, and absolutely no one ate before the Lord had lifted his own spoon. Every bite was a ritual, an act of obedience dressed as civility. Even laughter had its rules. The jesters might perform freely, but the courtiers knew precisely when to smile and when to fall silent. Too much mirth, and one risked appearing foolish. Too little, and one risked being thought proud. Outside, beyond the thick gates and walls, the peasants toiled in the fields. To them, the castle was both protector and prisoner, place of power they depended on, yet never fully understood. They followed their own set of rules, handed down by the Lord's bailiff and the rhythms of the land. But inside, the hidden code was far more intricate. Every visitor, every gesture, every glance was part of a delicate dance of deference and dominance. The lady of the castle had her own sphere of influence, though bound by custom as tightly as her corset strings. Her mornings began with prayer, her afternoons with endless management. She oversaw linen, kitchens, and the training of young girls destined for service or marriage. But her true power lay in her ability to maintain harmony among the women of the household. One whispered complaint, one suspected favor, could fracture the fragile balance and invite scandal. So she, too, followed the rules, gracefully, quietly, always aware that eyes were watching, the most secret of all rules. However, was the one few spoke of, loyalty to the Lord, even when the Lord was wrong. In a castle, disobedience was not just rebellion, it was betrayal. To question an order was to question the foundation of the world itself. Servants who spoke out could vanish by morning. Guards who hesitated might find themselves assigned to the coldest post on the battlements. And yet, beneath the silence, resentment often brewed. Many lived by the rules outwardly while dreaming of a freer life beyond the walls. The castle was a paradox. To outsiders, it symbolized strength and stability. To those within, it was a cage gilded by ritual. Each corridor echoed not only with footsteps, but with centuries of expectation. The rules were never written down, yet they were passed through generations, refined, reinforced, and feared. Even the children were not spared. The sons of nobles were trained to bow at the right angle, to hold their tongues in front of their elders, and to memorize the proper titles of visiting knights. The daughters learned how to stitch, pour wine, and lower their eyes at compliments. Innocence was replaced by etiquette before they were old enough to question why, at night, when torches flickered and shadows danced across the walls, the castle seemed to breathe differently. The great hall fell silent. The guards kept watch, and only the whispers of wind through arrow slits broke the stillness. Yet even in sleep, the rules remained. No servant slept past their bell. No fire burned without permission. And in the Lord's chamber, the heavy doors closed, not just against the cold, but against uncertainty, fear, and ambition. This was the hidden order of the medieval world, a network of power and obedience that bound everyone together. It was not forged by law, but by tradition. And like the castle's great walls, it endured through centuries, weathering storms, wars, and human frailty. Tomorrow, another day would dawn. The same footsteps would echo through the same halls, and the same rules would quietly dictate every move. No one questioned them, because to live inside a medieval castle was not to ask why, it was simply to obey. Night in the castle always arrived early, long before the sun had fully vanished. The thick walls, built for defense, swallowed sound and light alike. Torches sputtered against the damp stone, sending thin streams of smoke curling toward vaulted ceilings. By this hour, the great hall was empty save for a few guards standing watch, and the faint whisper of the steward's quill scratching across parchment. It was in these quiet hours that the invisible machine of the castle truly revealed itself. The steward's desk was covered in neat rows of records, lists of grain stores, rations, fines, and punishments. Each entry represented a rule followed or broken, and behind each number was a person who had either obeyed or failed. In a world where loyalty and labor kept the castle alive, there was no such thing as a minor mistake. The steward himself was the embodiment of the system, a man who answered to the Lord, yet held the power to command every soul below him. His word could decide whether a kitchen maid ate that night, or whether a stable boy spent his next week cleaning latrines. But even he was bound by unseen chains. Every order he gave, every judgment he made, had to reflect the will of the Lord, an expectation so heavy that it kept him awake long after the last torch burned out. If he showed favoritism, he risked envy and gossip. If he showed mercy, he risked the Lord's wrath. And so he lived in a delicate balance, ruling firmly but invisibly, like the ghost of the castle's authority. In the kitchens below, that authority was absolute. The kitchen was a world unto itself, furnace of heat, motion, and hierarchy. At the top stood the cook, a woman of formidable presence whose word was law among the scullions and servants. She had learned the rules through years of quiet observation, how to keep the Lord's meat tender, how to ensure the bread rose in the cold air of the keep, and most importantly, how to maintain order. Each servant beneath her was assigned a station: the turnspit boy who roasted meats, the washer who scoured the pots, the herb girl who chopped leaves for stews. Every movement was measured, every mistake accounted for. If the bread burned, the cook didn't simply scold. She recorded it in her ledger, which would later find its way to the steward's table. Repetition meant punishment harsh, but never questioned. Discipline wasn't cruelty in the castle. It was structure. Without it, the castle would descend into chaos. And chaos was a greater fear than hunger. In the Lord's household, discipline took a subtler form. The ladies in waiting, who surrounded the noble woman like a living shield of propriety, moved according to a rhythm as strict as a soldier's drill. Their duties changed with the hour embroidering at midday, reading scripture by afternoon light, combing and dressing the lady's hair by candlelight. Yet every task was accompanied by silence. Words had weight, and the wrong word could cost one's position. Gossip was the most dangerous of all offenses, for it spread like fire through the stone halls. Reaching ears it was never meant to. Still, secrets were inevitable. Within a castle, nothing stayed hidden for long. Servants overheard quarrels behind half-closed doors. Guards shed murmurs in the cold. Even the humblest stable hand sometimes carried knowledge worth a king's ransom. And so, another rule was born, the rule of discretion. To hear something forbidden was to carry it to one's grave. The art of silence was a survival skill more valuable than loyalty itself. Higher still, in the chambers of the nobility, power was performed as much as it was held. When the Lord sat in council, he did not simply speak, he demonstrated authority through ritual. Every gesture, from the placement of his seal to the tilt of his head, reinforced his dominance. His knights arrayed before him stood in disciplined stillness. None spoke unless addressed. The Lord's words were not debated. They were absorbed, weighed, and obeyed. Disagreement, if it existed, was disguised as humility. Those who understood how to navigate this performance, how to appear loyal without appearing servile, rose quickly. Those who didn't often vanished from favor without ever knowing why. Beyond the politics of power, there existed the sacred order, the presence of the chapel, ever watching, ever reminding all of their place before God. Every castle held a small chapel or oratory, tended by a priest who served both the Lord's family and the household staff. Here too, hierarchy reigned. Nobles knelt near the altar. Servants knelt behind them. The prayers were the same, but the space between them spoke volumes. In the medieval mind, faith and order were bound together. To disobey one's Lord was not just rebellion against man, but rebellion against divine will. And so the chapel's bell marked not just the hours of worship, but the rhythm of submission. Even mealtimes reflected this sacred order. The Lord's table gleamed with polished pewter, fine linen, and silver goblets, while servants ate from wooden bowls in silence near the kitchens. The food that reached the Lord's plate had already passed through a dozen hands tasted, tested and inspected to ensure it was pure. Poison, though rare, was feared as the weapon of intrigue. One could never be too careful, especially when ambition brewed in the shadows. Outside the main halls, the guards and soldiers lived by their own Code 1, forged by hardship and loyalty. Their lives revolved around the defense of the keep. They drilled daily, maintained the weapons, and kept the fires lit along the walls. Yet even among them, rank divided. A captain could eat meat twice a week. A footman rarely saw it at all. And while their armor gleamed under torchlight during inspections, most slept in damp rooms beneath the towers, their beds made of straw, their blankets thin against the biting cold. Still, they endured, because to serve the castle was to serve something greater than themselves. The rules gave them purpose. Without the structure, they were merely men. Within it, they were part of a living fortress. It was said that a castle never slept, and that was true. Long after the nobles retired, a faint hum of life continued through the corridors. The laundresses worked by candlelight, washing linens until their hands cracked. The night watch paced slowly across the battlements, eyes scanning the dark horizon. The clerk copied records by the glow of a single lamp, preserving the endless details of fealty and duty that defined the castle's existence. The cycle was endless, but none questioned it, for questioning meant danger. Those who had once tried to challenge the order, be they servants, squires, or even knights, had been reminded of their place with swift precision. And yet, in the quiet of the night, some dared to dream. A kitchen boy might imagine escaping through the postern gate and joining a band of traveling minstrels. A laundress might picture a small cottage beyond the fields. Even the steward, for all his authority, sometimes wondered what it would feel like to wake one morning without the weight of rules pressing on his chest. But these were dangerous thoughts, and by morning, they were forgotten, buried beneath the clatter of buckets, the bark of orders, and the relentless rhythm of the day. Inside the castle, rules were not just enforced, they were believed in. They gave shape to existence, meaning to labor, and identity to each soul within the walls. To the medieval mind, freedom was not the absence of rules, it was the ability to find peace within them. And so the castle endured, a world of discipline and devotion, bound together by invisible strings that no one dared to cut. As the dawn light crept once again over the parapets, the bell began to toll, summoning the castle back to motion. Another day, another set of duties, another round of obedience and survival. The people stirred, not because they wanted to, but because they must. And within that endless must lay the secret of the medieval castle's endurance. It was not built merely of stone and mortar, but of habits, rules, and faith that outlasted any one lifetime. The morning bell echoed through the stone halls long before the sun reached the parapets. Its hollow clang reverberated off every wall, seeping into the dreams of those still huddled under rough wall blankets. Sleep was a rare luxury in a castle. The day belonged to duty, and duty began before dawn. By the time the second bell rang, the servants were already in motion. The courtyard filled with the sound of wooden buckets, clattering tools, and the bark of instructions. It was not chaos, though it might have seemed so to an outsider. It was the sound of the castle's order breathing to life. Everyone knew where to be, what to do, and above all, who to obey. Hierarchy wasn't just a social structure. It was survival. The kitchen maid who forgot to curtsy to the cook risked a slap. The squire who failed to polish his knight's armor properly risked humiliation in front of his peers. In a castle, pride and obedience lived side by side, bound together by fear and necessity. Inside the Lord's chambers, the day began differently. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and rose oil. The Lord's personal servants entered quietly, careful not to disturb him until the first light touched the canopy of his bed. There was a ritual to everything: the folding of his blankets, the heating of water for washing, the laying out of garments according to rank and occasion. The Lord himself might not notice the details, but the absence of them would be an offense. For the servants, there was an art to invisibility. They moved like ghosts, silent, precise, their eyes downcast. A lord's displeasure could cost a servant more than their position. It could mean a beating, or worse, banishment from the only world they knew. To be dismissed from a castle was to vanish into poverty. Every servant understood that rule, even if it was never spoken. The lady of the castle rose to a different kind of order. Her chamber was her domain, and every object within it reflected her status. The tapestries told stories of lineage and conquest, reminders that she was part of something greater than herself. Yet her life was not her own. Her words, her gestures, even her expressions were watched by others: the maid who dressed her hair, the steward who delivered messages, the guards who bowed as she passed. Her power was ceremonial, her dignity a performance. Even affection was regulated. A lady could smile, but not too warmly. She could speak with a knight, but not in private. Beneath the silken grace, there was the fear of scandal, of whispers that could undo her entire household. Reputation was a currency more fragile than gold, and in the medieval world, one rumor could destroy a lineage. In the courtyard below, the castle's young men trained with wooden swords, their breath steaming in the cold air. Their shouts rang out across the stones, sharp and disciplined. To them, knighthood was not yet burdened by politics. It was a dream, a promise of glory. But behind the glamour of shining armor lay another rule: obedience to death. A knight's honor was tied not to his victories, but to his loyalty. To question one's lord was to court ruin. The captain of the guard watched the drills from the wall, his arms crossed. He had seen real battles, and his eyes carried the tired wisdom of someone who knew what loyalty cost. They trained for glory, he muttered once, but glory dies faster than men. He never said it aloud again. The walls had ears, and cynicism was a dangerous indulgence. The castle walls themselves were a symbol of orderthic, unyielding, eternal. To those within, they offered safety. To those without, they represented power. But to live inside them was to exist in a world where privacy was a myth. The sound of footsteps carried through corridors. Conversations echoed off stone, and eyes seemed to linger everywhere. Even the smallest actor servant pocketing a leftover crust of bread could be noticed, whispered about, and punished. Bread, in fact, was a quiet symbol of control. Every loaf was counted, every portion weighed. The kitchen clerk kept careful records of grain and flour, ensuring that none disappeared. Food was power, and to control food was to control people. In harsh winters, when supplies ran low, the Lord decided who would eat and who would not. Sometimes, the poorest servants went hungry while the Lord's table remained full. No one dared complain. Hunger was a reminder of one's place in the order of things. Even the children of the castle does, born to servants and guards, learned obedience early. They fetched water, carried messages, and ran errands through the winding halls. They were taught to bow before nobles and to never look them directly in the eye. For them, childhood ended early. A boy of 10 could already be apprenticed to the blacksmith, learning to swing a hammer heavy enough to bruise his palms. A girl the same age might already be scrubbing linens in icy water until her hands bled. Yet, amid all the control and labor, there were moments of strange beauty. When the sunlight struck the stained glass of the chapel, the whole chamber glowed in reds and blues like liquid jewels. When the musicians played during a feast, the air trembled with song, and for a fleeting hour, laughter drowned out the grind of duty. But even those moments were choreographed, the musicians playing only when permitted. The laughter never too loud. At the highest level of the castle's unspoken rules was the law of appearances. What the Lord's guest saw defined his honor. If a visiting noble entered the great hall and found it unkempt or disorganized, it was not the servants who bore the shamit, was the Lord himself. Thus, discipline flowed downward, but reputation flowed upward. Every person within the walls carried a piece of the Lord's dignity on their shoulders. This is why punishments were often public. When a servant stole, they were not simply corrected, they were displayed. Sometimes beaten, sometimes shamed, sometimes locked in the stocks outside the gate where peasants could see. The message was simple. Disobedience brings humiliation, and humiliation is worse than pain. The castle ruled not only through authority, but through fear of disgrace. Even religion reinforced the structure. The priest's sermons reminded everyone that God himself had ordained their roles. The Lord ruled by divine right, the servant obeyed by divine duty, and to defy that order was sin. The words were comforting and terrifying in equal measure. They gave meaning to suffering, but they also silenced rebellion. Still, deep within the minds of the people, there were quiet doubts. The laundress who prayed each night wondered if God truly cared for her aching back. The stable hand who tended the horses imagined a world without lords and orders. But such thoughts were dangerous, so they stayed buried, smothered by repetition and exhaustion. The castle had no room for free thought. Only the rhythm of obedience. When evening returned, torches flickered once again along the ramparts. The day ended as it began with sound. The clang of metal doors, the crackle of fire, the fading murmurs of servants retreating to their quarters. The Lord dined with his household, speaking in low tones of politics and alliances, while the servants below ate thin stew from wooden bowls. Yet, despite the difference in comfort, both groups were bound by the same invisible force, the rules that defined their existence. The castle was not merely a building. It was a living organism, pulsing with the routines and fears of everyone who dwelled within. Its walls held centuries of whispered confessions, small betrayals, and unspoken dreams. It was a world where freedom meant knowing your limits, and peace came only to those who never questioned the order of things. When the final bell of the night rang out, it was a sound both soothing and chilling. It signaled rest, but also reminded everyone that the day would come again exactly as before. The rhythm would not change. The rules would not break. The castle would endure, because endurance was its truest law. And somewhere in that deep, echoing silence between the bells, the souls within the castle lords and servants alike dream, not of freedom, but of simply belonging. Night in a castle was never truly dark. Even after the torches guttered out along the walls, a faint red glow lingered from hearths left to die. The corridors breathed with quiet, a shuffle of boots, the sigh of a draught through arrow slits, the muffled murmur of a guard changing post. It was in these hours when the nobles slept and the servants crept that the castle revealed its other life, the one not spoken of in daylight. Every castle had a space no one wished to mention. Sometimes it was called the Undercroft, sometimes the Holdfast, sometimes simply below. Stone steps sank into cold earth where the air smelled of dampened iron. The guards called it the belly of the beast. For most, it was a place known only by rumor, where men vanished, where cries could not climb back up to daylight. The prisoners kept there were not always enemies from battle. More often, they were offenders against the castle's own code. A thief, a deserter, a servant accused of speaking ill of his lord. Guilt mattered less than example. To live within walls so strict, the people needed to see what happened when one rule cracked in the torchlight. Iron rings gleamed against stone. Chains hung like vines, cold and patient. The jailer moved among them with a wooden torch and a ring of keys that clattered like bones. He did not wear armor, only a stained leather apron. His eyes were steady, not cruel, merely resigned. Punishment was his trade, as much a craft as smithing or tailoring. He obeyed orders, and orders rarely needed reasons. Up above, the castle continued its routines. The lord might host a feast, the lady might play the harp, the priest might bless the evening meal. None of them would speak of the screams that sometimes drifted through the grates. To acknowledge them would be to admit that power required pain, so they pretended not to hear. When dawn returned, those same corridors filled again with the scurry of servants. The punishments of the night were scrubbed, a wastrel replaced, blood rinsed from the flagstones, water thrown from buckets that steamed in the chill air. The castle always woke, clean, proper, and orderly. It was part of the illusion that life here was divine and just. Justice, in truth, was a fragile thing inside these walls. It bent with the will of whoever held the keys. A minor slight against a noble could mean a beating. The same crime by a knight might be forgiven with wine and a laugh. The law of the castle was not written, it was lived through power and fear. Even confession followed rank. A noble confessed sins softly to the chaplain, emerging lighter, absolved. A servant confessed with knees pressed to cold stone, waiting for the priest's verdict and perhaps the lash. The church promised salvation, but it also served as the moral armor of authority. God's will and the Lord's will were painted as one among the lower folk. Tales spread of ghosts that haunted the dungeon stairs, former prisoners whose souls could not leave. The stories were warnings told to children: behave, obey, keep silent, or the spirits will find you. In truth, the ghosts were memories of what happened to anyone who questioned the order. The castle did not need chains for everyone. Fear itself was the heaviest shackle. Yet within this harsh system, people found strange ways to survive. A cook might sneak extra bread to a guard who turned a blind eye during her errands. A maid might hide a token of friendship beneath a flagstone, a secret reminder that kindness still existed. The small rebellions went unnoticed or deliberately ignored. They were the quiet pulse of humanity beating beneath the armor of control. Once a month, the Lord held open court in the Great Hall. Villagers from surrounding lands came to present disputes or seek favor. The hall transformed into a theater of hierarchy. The Lord sat elevated on his dais, the steward at his side, scribes hunched over parchment, ready to record every word. Petitioners stood below, heads bowed. Each gesture mattered the distance between speaker and dais, the pace at which one approached, the angle of the bow. Even the way a peasant held his cap could decide whether mercy or anger followed. These were the unwritten rules, passed down by imitation and fear. The court ended not with applause, but with silence. Those who had pleased the Lord backed away, relieved. Those who had not were dragged toward the lower stairs. The servants whispered about those dragged away. Some said they were taken to the oubliette, a pit so deep its name meant to forget. Others believed they were sent to toil in the cold storage caverns, unseen until their punishment ended. It ended. Truth was scarce in a place that depended on secrecy above. The tapestries and banners told stories of glorious aims, victories, hunts. They were bright lies woven to distract from the grey truth below. Every castle was a contradiction. Beauty on the walls, misery in the foundations. Yet no one dared to call it hypocrisy. To name the truth would be to unravel the very thread that kept the world in order. When winter arrived, the rules grew even tighter. Food dwindled, tempers sharpened, and the walls trapped more than heat. Isolation bred suspicion. A missing loaf of bread could start an inquiry. A whispered complaint could become an accusation. The steward listened, recorded, punished. In those long frozen nights, loyalty was the only warmth left, and still, amid all the dread, there were those who believed in the idea of the castle, the shining promise of protection, the symbol of civilization in a brutal world. To them, these rules and punishments were the necessary price of peace. Outside the walls were raiders, wolves, and famine. Inside, there was structure, order, and the illusion of safety. That illusion was powerful enough to keep people obedient for generations. The same bell that woke them at dawn also lulled them to sleep at night. Its rhythms stitched their lives together, one repetition at a time, until obedience no longer felt forced, it felt natural, and so the hidden rules endured. They were never written in ink or carved into stone, yet they outlasted kings and wars. They lived in gestures, glances, and silences. They shaped the way hands folded in prayer, how voices softened in the presence of power, how eyes turned away from suffering. The medieval castle stood not merely as a fortress of stone, but as a fortress of thought, a place where the mind itself learned to kneel. High above the damp dungeons and echoing servant corridors, sunlight spilled through narrow windows, lined with colored glass. The light broke into shards of red, blue, and gold that trembled across the stone floors of the great chamber. Here, the air smelled not of sweat and straw, but of beeswax, perfume, and roasted meat. Yet even among the nobility, the walls whispered the same thing they did below. Obedience. Life in the upper levels of a medieval castle appeared calm, refined, even enviable. Ladies in silk gowns walked with trained grace, their steps measured and deliberate. Lords carried themselves with a practiced weight, their gestures slow, deliberate, and heavy with meaning. Every glance had caught, every pause before speaking, every smile that lasted a heartbeat too long. All of it was part of an invisible chess match that ruled who thrived and who fell. A lady-in-waiting might seem serene beside her mistress, but she was always watching. Every compliment she gave was weighed, every word chosen with care. To speak too boldly was to risk gossip, but to speak too little was to vanish into irrelevance. Reputation was currency, and rumor was a weapon sharper than any sword. The castle thrived on it. A web spun across every corridor, each thread leading to a listening ear. Meals in the great hall were grand performances. The long tables glittered with pewter dishes and golden goblets. Musicians played softly as servants carried steaming platters of venison, pheasant, or fish. Yet even in this splendor, hierarchy ruled every gesture. No one ate until the Lord raised his knife. No one left until he rose. Servants stood behind every chair, silent and watchful, waiting to refill cups or whisk away bones. What seemed like simple dining was actually a test. How you cut your meat, how you sipped your wine, how quickly you laughed at the Lord's joke. All could raise or ruin your standing. A single breach of etiquette could haunt you for months. Once branded as uncouth, foolish, or impious, your reputation sank. And so did your future. The lady of the castle bore her own burdens. She ruled the domestic sphere with quiet authority, yet her freedom was as limited as her husband's generosity. Her days began with prayer, then rounds through the solar to oversee embroidery, linen repairs, and the accounts of servants. She was expected to embody virtue, grace, and restraint, a living emblem of order. But behind closed doors, many felt the weight of isolation. Letters to distant family or friends were their only escape, and even those were censored or dictated by the Lord's steward. The noble children learned early that affection was not free. A son's worth was measured by how well he rode, fought, and obeyed. A daughter's by her beauty, piety, and ability to secure a profitable marriage. The laughter of youth seldom echoed long in the upper chambers. Lessons in Latin and etiquette replaced play, and servants reminded them daily that they carried the name of their house, not merely their own. At night, when the fires dimmed and music faded, the corridors of the upper castle took on a different mood. Behind closed doors, alliances shifted. A whisper from one noble to another might seal a marriage, a trade deal, or a betrayal. A smile in the morning could hide a knife that waited weeks to strike. Unlike the dungeon below, punishment here came dressed in charm, exile, disgrace, or ruin delivered with a gentle nod. One of the hidden rules of castle life was simple. The higher you climbed, the less room there was to breathe. Power demanded stillness. The more a person possessed, the more they were watched. A careless word could undo a dynasty. A rumor about infidelity, heresy, or cowardice could spread like smoke and choke an entire household. The Lord himself was never truly free. Though his banner flew proudly above the keep, he lived under constant pressure from his peers, the church, and his king. Every decision he made could shift the balance of loyalty among his knights or draw suspicion from the crown. The castle was his home, but also his cage. Sometimes, late at night, he walked the battlements alone. The wind howled over the parapets, carrying with it the faint smell of the village fires below. From here, the fields stretched dark and endless, a reminder of both his dominion and his dependence. Without his people, his title meant nothing. Without his rule, they would descend into chaos. It was a delicate illusion. He commanded by fear, yet feared being forgotten inside. The chapel glowed with candlelight, the air heavy with incense. The priest stood before the altar, chanting in Latin while nobles knelt on cold stone. Each word echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a warning. The church was both sanctuary and spy. Confession gave priests knowledge, and knowledge was power. More than one lord learned too late that a whispered secret in the confessional could find its way to royal ears. The chapel, like the great hall, had its own unspoken order. The lord and lady knelt nearest the altar, followed by their favored knights, then distant kin, then retainers. Servants lingered at the back, heads low. The distance from the altar was a map of importance, the diagram of who mattered most. Even faith had hierarchy here. To question the priest was to risk your soul. To disobey your lord was to risk your life. Between heaven and the dungeon, there was little room for free will. Despite it all, the people of the castle adapted. They smiled, curtsied, and played their parts. They learned that silence was safer than honesty, and small gestures could carry meaning. A folded handkerchief might signal alliance. A shared look might seal loyalty. In a world of rigid control, subtext became its own language, and yet, in moments between duties, a soft laugh shared between maids, a knight snaking bread to a hungry page. A secret song hummed during chores. Life slipped through the cracks. These tiny rebellions, harmless and fleeting, reminded them they were still human beneath the weight of custom and command. From the outside, the castle seemed indestructible. Stone towers crowned with banners, walls thick as trust. But within those walls, everything balanced on fragile understandings. Who was watching? Who was whispering? Who remembered? Who forgot to survive here? One had to master a skill greater than swordplay or prayer, the art of pretending. Pretending to love when you feared, pretending to obey when you doubted, pretending to be content while dreaming of freedom. And so the great game continued. Day after day, generation after generation. The dungeon taught obedience through terror. The great hall taught it through etiquette, and the private chambers taught it through silence. Every stone of the castle was heavy with memory of power won and lost, of secrets buried, of voices swallowed by time. But even centuries later, if you stand in the ruins of such a fortress and listen closely, you can almost hear the echoes of that invisible machinery still turning, the gears of fear, loyalty, and ambition grinding on long after the banners have fallen. If the Great Hall was the stage of power, then the castle's corridors were its backstage, shadowed arteries where true influence flowed unseen. Here, gossip was currency, and silence was a weapon. Servants moved quietly, eyes lowered, yet their ears caught everything. They passed unnoticed through rooms where nobles whispered and argued, their presence so common that they became invisible, and therefore, the most dangerous witnesses of all, a serving maid folding linens, might overhear the lady's secret quarrel with her husband. A page polishing armor could catch fragments of political scheming between knights. A cook tasting stew in the kitchens might hear more about the state of the realm than the lord himself. Knowledge seeped through the castle like smoke, carried on footsteps, laughter, and half-finished sentences. Servants, for all their lowly status, understood this power. They spoke in riddles and gestures, passing messages without words. A broom left, leaning against the wrong wall, might signal danger. A missing goblet could mean a meeting was postponed. The castle's unspoken language expanded with every generation, as invisible and intricate as the designs carved into its stone walls. Sometimes, these whispers reached far beyond the castle gates. A stable boy might befriend a merchant who carried his words to a distant manor. A lady's maid might share a rumor with a visiting nun who passed it to the bishop. The church, the crown, and rival lords all depended on this quiet network of eyes and ears. In an age before letters traveled safely, gossip was the bloodstream of politics. But the castle had its ways of punishing loose tongues. A servant caught spreading lies or truths at the wrong time might be dismissed without warning, or worse, locked in the cold tower where no one spoke their name again. The fear of vanishing kept many mouths sealed, but never for long. Even fear grows dull when surrounded by routine, and eventually, someone always whispered again, among the nobles, Deception was polished into art. A noble woman might smile across a banquet table at the very man plotting to ruin her family. She might even share a dance with him, their hands touching briefly, long enough for her to slip a hidden message into his palm, or, more daringly, to take one. Courtiers carried secrets the way knights carried swords, and their battles were fought in smiles, glances, and carefully chosen words. The castle's artwork hid secrets, too. Tapestries told stories, not just of saints and kings, but of warnings, alliances, and codes only a select few could read. A pattern in a border, a color placed out of sequence to the untrained eye. It was decoration. To the informed, it was information. Messages passed right under a lord's nose, woven into the very walls of his home in the solar, where the lady spent her afternoons with embroidery and company. Small rebellions took shape. While her needle traced patterns in silk, her mind plotted ways to secure her family's influence or protect her children's futures. The women of the castle were often dismissed as ornamental, but in truth, they were strategists cloaked in gentleness. They arranged marriages, bartered favors, and built alliances that could shape generations. A misplaced smile could invite scandal. A discreet kindness could purchase lifelong loyalty. No act was meaningless, and every relationship demanded careful tending. When a guest visited, the servants watched how long he lingered in the chapel. The Lord Steward noted which cupbearer refilled his drink most often. Every detail could matter later, when whispers turned into accusations or opportunity. And then there were the knights, symbols of loyalty and valor in storybooks. But in the castle's daily life, they were flesh and blood men, ambitious, restless, and bound by oaths they often bent to survive. Many had seen the brutality of war and returned not with glory but with scars. When not on campaign, they lived within the castle walls, training, drinking, and jostling for favor. To be a knight under a powerful lord meant serving his will without question. Yet even they had their own networks. Brotherhoods formed in secret, sharing loyalties that crossed banners. One knight's whisper could move armies if he knew the right ear to reach. Feasts were often louder with laughter than they should have been, a sure sign that too many hidden truths simmered beneath the surface at times. The castle became a kind of living creature, its moods shifting with the rumors that passed through it. A rumor of war made the great hall tense. Laughter returned when trade was good. Silence descended when taxes rose. The castle breathed through its people, sighing through the servants' whispers, grumbling through the guards' complaints, laughing through the lord's feasts. But perhaps the strangest rule of all was this: to survive, one must always seem loyal, even when one was not. A lady betrayed by her husband might still smile at his side during Mass. A squire whose family had fallen out of favor might train twice as hard, pretending not to hear the insults. A priest who doubted the Lord's devotion might still bless his supper each night. Everyone wore a mask, and the more convincing the mask, the safer the person beneath it. Every once in a while, though, someone forgot their place. A servant too bold with their words, a knight too honest with his opinions, a noble too careless with her pride. And then the hidden gears of power began to grind. Servants were reassigned or dismissed. Knights were sent to distant outposts. Nobles suddenly fell ill, or their fortunes declined. It was never called punishment, only God's will, and so every dawn began the same way. The castle woke, stretched, and returned to its dance. Bells rang in the chapel. Fires crackled in the kitchens. Servants hurried, Knights bickered, ladies whispered. Life flowed on as if nothing ever changed, though everyone knew that one misstep could shatter it all. As night fell, torches flickered against the ancient stone. Their glow painted shadows that twisted across the walls, long, distorted shapes that looked almost alive. Those shadows told their own stories of ambition, jealousy, love, and loss. If you watched long enough, you could almost believe the walls themselves remembered everything, because they did. Every argument, every secret meeting, every act of mercy or cruelty, it all sank into the stone. The castle's memory outlasted those who built it, lived in it, and died within it. The people might forget, but the stones never did. And so, even centuries later, when ivy crept over the ruins and wind whistled through the broken windows, you could still feel the weight of those invisible rules pressing down the quiet, suffocating order that once governed every heartbeat inside a medieval castle. For every feast held in the great hall, there was a dungeon deep below that heard a very different kind of song. The laughter of lords and ladies above was answered by the muffled moans of those who had fallen from favor. Every medieval castle had its prison, sometimes little more than a pit carved into the rock, and its rules were as cold as the stone that built them. Few saw these cells, and fewer returned from them. A single accusation, even whispered, could be enough to condemn a person. In a world ruled by oaths and reputation, being accused was almost as dangerous as being guilty. A man might be thrown into the dungeon for stealing a loaf of bread from the kitchen, or for offending the Lord's pride, or simply for knowing too much. The dungeon keeper, the jailer, lived in a world between life and death. His was a necessary cruelty, neither praised nor despised, just quietly tolerated. He slept among the chains and iron keys, knowing every creak of the steps above. Some said he knew the castle's true secrets better than its lord, for he heard every confession, every curse, and every bargain whispered in the dark. The prisoners varied. There were common thieves shackled beside fallen knights, spies caught with coded messages sewn into their sleeves, servants who had talked too freely, sometimes even nobles, stripped of titles and finery, crouched on the straw floor, staring at the damp walls that used to echo their laughter. The castle that once protected them became their cage, and yet the dungeon wasn't only for punishment. It was also a warning. When a servant passed near the tower and heard the faint clatter of chains below, they were reminded to mind their tongue. When the noble guests dined and glanced at the heavy doors leading downward, they remembered that even privilege had limits. Fear was the quietest and most effective law in a castle. No parchment or signature could enforce it better. The castle's fear spread upward too. The Lord himself lived surrounded by it. Though he ruled from the high table, he knew his position was always fragile. His power came from the loyalty of men who could just as easily betray him if the winds of politics shifted. Many slept lightly, dreaming not of victory, but of survival. Behind every show of splendor, every tournament, every banquet, every ceremony, there was a whisper of paranoia. Who among the guests could be trusted? Which smile hid a grudge? Even family bonds were uncertain. Brothers quarreled over inheritances. Sons turned against fathers. Daughters were married off as pawns in fragile alliances. A castle was not just a fortress of stone, it was a fortress of secrets. And in that fortress, love itself could be dangerous. A knight who fell for the lady of the castle risked not only his honor, but his life. The act of loving above one's station was seen as a challenge to order, a threat to hierarchy. There were stories, whispered, never written, of knights hanged in their armor, of ladies banished to convents for loving the wrong man. Yet such passions could not always be suppressed. In the cold silence of stone halls, where emotion was forbidden, even a stolen glance could feel like rebellion. The chaplain, ever watchful, preached obedience and patience. He reminded all that sin began not with action but with thought. His sermons echoed through the chapel, but his eyes followed more than souls. Many a priest became the Lord's silent informant, trading salvation for secrets. And yet, some confessed their own guilt in the dead of night, torn between faith and the sins they could not name aloud. One of the cruelest truths of Castle, life was how invisible justice could be. Trials were rare and often meaningless, decided by power, not by truth. A noble might bribe the judge. A servant might be tortured until they said what their master wanted to hear. Justice was not blind. It simply looked away. The castle itself was designed for control. Every doorway, every stair, every hall had a purpose, not only for defense, but for watching. The Lord's private chamber was positioned so he could oversee the courtyard. The guard towers were spaced to give no blind spots. The servants' paths were built beneath the main floors, allowing them to move unseen. Even the architecture whispered authority. And when the walls began to whisper too loudly, when rebellion brewed or old resentment stirred, the castle turned inward. Feasts became rarer, guards grew sharper, and the fires in the hearths seemed to burn colder. The balance between order and chaos was fragile, and everyone inside knew it. A single disappearance could change everything, perhaps. It began with a missing servant, one who had overheard something she shouldn't. Perhaps it was a knight who rode out on patrol and never returned. In a place where loyalty was demanded but never guaranteed, every loss carried suspicion. Eyes turned inward. Accusations spread like disease. Soon, the air itself felt heavier. Laughter died quickly in the great hall. The musicians played softer. People spoke in shorter sentences, choosing every word as if the walls themselves were listening. Because, in a way, they were not. Many castles had whispering galleries, curved stone corridors that carried even the quietest sound from one end to the other. Lords and spies both used them, standing in silence to eavesdrop on words never meant for their ears. One careless sentence could travel farther than its speaker ever imagined. When things reached their breaking point, the castle often found its scapegoat. Someone to blame, someone to sacrifice. Not necessarily guilty, but convenient. A public punishment restored the illusion of order. Servants returned to work. The Lord's authority felt secure again. But beneath that calm, everyone knew the truth. It could happen to any of them. Some, however, found ways to survive. There were those who mastered the art of invisibility, blending in so perfectly that no one ever noticed their presence. A kitchen boy who remembered every overheard word but spoke none. A maid who moved so silently that she could vanish before anyone realized she'd been there. These people were the castle's shadows, slipping between danger and opportunity, shaping events without leaving a trace. Others thrived on chaos. There were men and women who whispered false rumors on purpose, testing loyalties, stirring doubt. They could rise through the ranks not by strength or birth, but by manipulation. A word here, a suggestion there, and suddenly they were indispensable. In a world ruled by fear, knowledge was power, and lies were often more valuable than truth. Still, no amount of cunning could erase the unease that haunted every soul within the walls. The castle might stand proud against invaders, but its true enemies were always inside. Mistrust, greed, and the slow corrosion of conscience. By candlelight, a servant prayed for protection. In the Lord's chamber, a noble wrote a secret letter to a rival. In the chapel, the priest whispered a confession no one would ever hear. And down below, in the cold dungeon, a prisoner waited in silence, listening to the footsteps above, wondering if the world had already forgotten him. That was the true nature of a medieval castle, not just stone and steel, but a living organism of power, fear, and fragile order. Its rules weren't written on parchment. They were etched into human behavior, reinforced by centuries of survival. The castle didn't just protect its people, it controlled them. There comes a moment in every kingdom when the walls that once promised safety begin to feel like cages. The people inside a castle could sense this long before it ever appeared in the chronicles. Servants spoke of strange silences in the halls, of the hearth's warmth fading even when the fire still burned. The guards, once proud in their armor, began to murmur of unpaid wages and uncertain loyalties. Something unseen was shifting, a quiet rebellion growing not in the fields or villages, but within the very heart of the fortress. The castle had always been a machine built to control, but machines wear down. Generations of fear could only hold people for so long before the cracks began to show. When famine struck, when taxes rose, when wars dragged on too long, the people began to wonder if obedience was still worth their suffering. It didn't start with open revolt. Rebellion in a medieval castle was never loud at first. It began with the smallest acts of defiance. A servant who diluted the Lord's wine, a blacksmith who deliberately dulled a sword, a messenger who delayed a letter just long enough for it to matter. These quiet choices, invisible to most, began to erode the castle's invisible order. Even among the nobles, dissent found a home. Rival factions formed in whispers. Old allies grew cautious. Promises made at the high table were quietly broken by candlelight. The same walls that had witnessed centuries of loyalty were now listening to plots of betrayal in many ways. The end of the castle system was written not in blood, but in doubt. The Lord, once untouchable, became a prisoner of his own paranoia. He held more banquets than before, desperate to remind his court of unity. But the laughter sounded forced, the wine too sweet, the glances between guests too sharp. He felt the shift even when no one dared to speak of it. His own guards began to look at him with tired eyes, as though silently weighing whether his rule was still worth dying for. The lady of the castle, once a figure of grace and order, found her authority slipping too. The servants no longer rushed when she called. Her words, once law, now met hesitation. Rumors swirled through the corridors, not always true, but always dangerous. The illusion of harmony that had defined the castle for centuries was disintegrating, and below them all, the people who had suffered most began to dream of something unthinkable. Freedom to the peasant who had scrubbed floors or served meals his whole life. The castle had always been an unchangeable fact, as eternal as the sky. But when whispers of revolt began to echo from beyond the gates, from distant villages and broken kingdoms, those same peasants started to realize the walls were not gods. They were stone, and stone could fall. The clergy felt the tremors too. Priests, who had long served as the moral spine of the castle, began to question their role. Was it truly God's will that one man feasted while another starved? Was it righteous to preach humility to the poor while lords built new towers in their own honor? For the first time, even faith wavered beneath the weight of hypocrisy. But no rebellion can exist without a spark, and that spark often came from within. One evening, perhaps after another lavish feast meant to mask growing fear, a trusted guard or steward might slip a message through a hidden passage, a signal to the outside. The walls that once kept danger out now became a trap for those inside. At dawn, a gate left accidentally unbarred, a torch extinguished at the wrong moment, or a guard conveniently looking the other way could be all it took. What followed was rarely noble or clean. Rebellion within a castle was chaos made flesh. The same halls that had echoed with prayers and laughter became battlegrounds. Fire spread through corridors built of oak and cloth. The great banners that once symbolized honor were trampled underfoot. The air filled with the clash of steel, the screams of betrayal, and the shattering of order. Yet even as flames licked the towers and panic spread, there were those who tried to save the only thing that had ever mattered to them, not their lives, but their sense of place. Some servants dragged the wounded to safety, even if they had been cruel masters. Some knights defended the walls long after the lord they served had fled. And some, even as everything burned, prayed for the soul of the castle itself, as if it were a living being dying before their eyes. When the smoke finally cleared, what remained was never the same. The lord might survive. Stripped of wealth and title, his fortress in ruins. The servants would scatter, carrying stories instead of orders. And in the years that followed, the castle would stand as a relic, a hollow monument to an age of control that had finally collapsed under its own weight. But not all endings were violent. Some castles simply withered in silence. In the later Middle Ages, as kingdoms stabilized and wars waned, many castles became obsolete. Trade grew, cities expanded, and kings built palaces instead, symbols of wealth, not war. The old fortresses stood empty, their halls echoing only with the wind. Ivy crept over the battlements, and moss filled the cracks between stones. The servants' quarters rotted away, and even the dungeons filled with dust. Yet even in decay, the castle's presence lingered. Villagers still spoke of it in hushed tones, as though it could hear them. Children dared each other to approach its gates. The ghosts of lords and prisoners alike were said to wander the ruins, replaying scenes of power, punishment, and fear. The rules that had governed those walls, obedience, silence, hierarchy did not vanish when the stones fell. They simply moved outward into new forms of power. Parliaments, armies, cities, and corporations. The castle was gone, but its spirit of control lived on. Every gatehouse became a metaphor for exclusion. Every throne became a boardroom. Every lord found his successor in a different age, wearing a different crown. Humanity never forgot how to build castles. We just stopped using stone. And yet, in the quiet moments when you stand before the ruins of one, you can still feel what those people once felt. Fear, safety, and confinement all at once. You can almost hear the footsteps of a servant hurrying to obey, the soft weeping from the dungeons below, the tense laughter from a feast meant to hide the truth, because the castle was more than a structure. It was a mirror, one that reflected the best and worst of human nature. It showed how power could unite people, and how easily it could destroy them. It revealed how loyalty could be both virtue and curse. And most of all, it taught that no wall, no matter how thick, could contain the human will forever. The hidden rules of a medieval castle were never just about survival within stone walls. They were about the delicate balance between obedience and freedom, control and chaos, authority and compassion. And as history marched forward, as empires rose and fell, the lesson remained the same. Those who build walls to control others inevitably find themselves trapped behind them. If you were to wake up one morning inside a medieval castle, it would not take long to understand that every person within those walls had a place, and that place was fixed as firmly as the stones that surrounded you. From the moment you opened your eyes to the first echoing footsteps in the corridor, life in a castle was defined by hierarchy. It governed who spoke first, who ate first, who stood where, and even who could look whom in the eye. To break these unspoken laws was more dangerous than drawing a blade at the top of this rigid world stood the Lord, the master of all he surveyed. He was both ruler and prisoner of his own authority. To those beneath him, he seemed untouchable, almost divine. His word could decide life or death, freedom or suffering. Yet, behind closed doors, even he was shackled, not by iron, but by expectations. A lord could not show weakness. He could not afford hesitation or mercy when order demanded cruelty. Every decision he made was watched and weighed by those around him. The knights who measured his strength, the servants who whispered in the kitchens, the lady who ruled the household's rhythm. To falter was to invite chaos. Beside him stood the lady of the castle, a figure often underestimated, yet indispensable. Her realm was not the battlefield, but the household, and her authority was absolute within it. She managed servants, arranged marriages, balanced supplies, and kept order in the midst of endless male ambition. In many castles, her intelligence held everything together when war, famine, or plague threatened to tear it apart. She understood the hidden politics of the chamber and the courtyard, the small negotiations that kept a household functioning. While her husband dealt in war and law, she wielded diplomacy and subtle influence. Servants feared her precision. Knights respected her composure. The quiet power of the lady was the kind that could shape generations, though it was rarely written in chronicles. Beneath the ruling pair stretched an intricate web of roles: knights, squires, stewards, cooks, blacksmiths, maids, and stable hands. Each was bound to their duty by invisible threads of loyalty and fear. The knights, for instance, were the visible embodiment of the Lord's might. They were trained from boyhood to serve and die for their master. Their armor gleamed in sunlight, but their lives were filled with duty rather than freedom. They were not permitted to question their Lord's will. They existed to enforce order and defend the walls that enclosed them all. Their squires, boys from lesser noble families, learned by watching. They carried armor, tended to horses, and endured endless humiliation in the name of preparation. Every misstep was punished, every failure a lesson in obedience. By the time they earned their spurs, they had been broken and reforged into something unshakably loyal. And then there were the servants, the silent pulse of castle life. Their hands lit the fires, scrubbed the floors, churned the butter, and prepared the banquets that upheld the illusion of grandeur. To be a servant was to be invisible yet essential. They knew every creaking stair, every whisper that passed in the halls. Many saw everything, yet spoke of nothing. Silence was not only survival, it was the first rule of service in the kitchens. Cooks commanded their own miniature kingdoms. Fires roared from dawn till dusk. Cauldrons bubbled with stews meant to feed dozens or even hundreds. Every meal was an act of politics, a display of abundance that reflected the Lord's power. If a dish was late, burnt, or underseasoned, it could spark more than anger. It could cause humiliation. Stable hands, too, lived by a strict rhythm. The horses were symbols of pride and mobility, and tending to them was both honor and burden. A poorly shoed horse could spell disaster on the battlefield or shame during a hunt. The stable was its own world, filled with the smell of hay and sweat, the rhythm of hooves, and the constant awareness that even the animals ranked higher than the people who cared for them. The castle's steward was the quiet administrator who kept everything moving. He collected rents, oversaw trade, and ensured that every servant was in their proper place. He was feared more than liked, a man who knew too many secrets and answered only to his lord. Beneath all these visible roles existed an underlayer of human reality: the servants' gossip, the guards' grudges, the private romances that defied boundaries. For all its order, the castle was alive with quiet defiance. A kitchen maid might fall in love with a squire. A knight might envy the lord he served. These emotions were dangerous, but inevitable. In the silence of the night, when torches dimmed and only the wind whispered through the towers, the rules that bound them all loosened, if only for a moment. But come dawn, the rhythm began again. The castle awoke with the clatter of buckets, the ring of iron, and the drone of chanting from the chapel. Every task was both worship and labor, a ritual of survival. Even the smallest gestures carried meaning. When a servant knelt, it was not just respect, it was survival. When a knight bowed his head, it was an acknowledgement of hierarchy older than memory. Every meal served, every floor scrubbed, every message delivered. All of it fed the invisible machine of order, and above them all, the castle itself watched. Its architecture was designed to remind everyone of their place. Narrow stairways forced the humble to bow. Raised dais and vaulted ceilings exalted the powerful. The walls were not only for defense, they were instruments of control. For those who lived within them, the hierarchy was so absolute that it felt natural. The thought of questioning it was as unthinkable as rebelling against the weather. Yet, occasionally, someone did. A servant who refused an order, a knight who questioned a command, and when that happened, the consequences were swift and merciless. The punishment for defiance varied. Some were whipped, others banished. A few disappeared entirely, their names struck from the rolls, their belongings divided before the next sunrise. Fear was the mortar that kept the castle's hierarchy standing, and yet, for all its cruelty, the system endured for centuries, because everyone, from lord to servant, believed that without it, there would be chaos. The true genius of the medieval castle was not its walls, nor its moats, nor its armies. It was its ability to make order feel sacred. The lord believed his power came from God. The servant believed their suffering was divinely ordained. The knight believed their loyalty was virtue, and in believing, they built a world that justified its own brutality. Still, in the smallest corners of that world, hope flickered. A maid slipping bread to a starving prisoner. A squire helping a peasant flee a punishment. Acts of mercy that defied the cold structure of duty. These moments were the castle's quiet rebellion, the whisper that not all hearts could be conquered by fear. And so, behind the stone and ceremony, life within a medieval castle was not just a tale of power, but of endurance, of people learning to survive a system that demanded their silence and sometimes their souls. If the castle had a beating heart, It was the Great Hall. This was where life and power intertwined, where a single glance could define a future, and a single misstep could end it. Everything that happened within these walls, from feasts to judgments, reflected the social order more vividly than any sermon or sword. The Great Hall was vast, echoing, and alive. The scent of roasted meat, smoke from the hearth, and beeswax candles filled the air. Along the stone walls hung banners, symbols of loyalty and conquest, each one telling the story of the family that ruled there. The flicker of torchlight danced across the banners and armor, casting a golden haze that made everything shimmer with false warmth. At the far end of the hall stood the high table, raised above the rest on a stone dais. It was not merely a place to eat. It was a stage for authority. The Lord and Lady sat here, framed by their most trusted knights and guests of honor. Every seat along that table was an unspoken statement of who mattered and who did not. Below them, stretching toward the door, were long wooden tables where the lower-ranking members of the household sat, squires, stewards, soldiers, and servants. Even the way one sat, spoke, or lifted a spoon reflected one's position. A squire who dared to eat before his superior, or a servant who accidentally drank from the wrong cup, might find themselves publicly humiliated before the evening ended. Food itself was a performance. The dishes were not simply sustenance, but symbols. Spiced meats, fresh loaves, and fine wines proclaimed wealth and stability, while watery stews and stale bread hinted at scarcity or mismanagement. The guests knew this. They tasted politics with every bite. When the feast began, the servants entered in carefully rehearsed sequence. Trays of roasted boar, whole fish glazed in honey, and steaming pies filled the air with temptation. Yet not everyone would taste these delicacies. The finest portions were served to the high table. By the time food reached the lower ranks, it was often cold or reduced to scraps. Still, no one dared complain. The ritual mattered more than the flavor. At the center of it all, the Lord maintained his performance. Every gesture, the way he raised his cup, spoke to his lady, or acknowledged a knight carried meaning. To laugh too loudly, to appear too generous, too quiet, or too cold could shift how his followers viewed him. Power in a medieval castle was delicate, a balance of fear and favor, performed daily under the watchful eyes of everyone from noble guests to spell hands. Lingering by the door that the lady of the castle had her own kind of stagecraft. Her duty was grace to smile at the right moment, to calm tensions before they surfaced, to offer a kind word that disguised careful strategy. A misplaced expression could start a rumor. A subtle compliment could secure an alliance. The Great Hall was as much her battlefield as the outer courtyard was her husband's. For guests, navigating this world required precision. Visiting lords, merchants, and envoys understood that every word could echo beyond the feast. Conversations about trade or territory were laced with polite deception, and alliances were forged not with signatures, but with shared goblets and calculated laughter. Even silence spoke volumes. A knight ignored by his lord during a feast might spend the night wondering if he had fallen from favor. A servant reprimanded publicly might become a cautionary tale for months. The Great Hall's brilliance concealed countless anxieties, all hidden behind smiling faces and flickering candles. The order of dining itself reflected the order of life. The meal began with prayers, led by the castle's priest. His words reminded everyone of their divine place, that the Lord's authority came from God. and that loyalty was not only duty but salvation. After the prayer, the feast began in descending order of rank. The higher one's station, the sooner their hunger was satisfied. Even how one ate mattered. Forks were rare, and manners were proof of breeding. A nobleman might tear bread gracefully with clean fingers and dab his lips with linen. A commoner who chewed too loudly or reached across the table risked a scolding. Those at the lower tables observed carefully, mimicking the motions of their superiors, learning the invisible codes that could one day elevate them or expose them. Beyond the dining and decorum, the great hall served as courtroom and theater. In daylight hours, it became the seat of judgment. Disputes between peasants, accusations of theft, and matters of punishment were brought before the Lord. Here, justice was swift, often harsh, and always public. The accused knelt before the dais, while the entire household looked on. The Lord's word was final. A man could lose his hand for stealing bread, or his life for defying an order. The spectacle reminded everyone of their place, that the same hall where laughter rang at night could echo with cries by day. But the great hall was not without warmth. During winter, it offered light and company when the world outside was nothing but darkness and frost. Here songs echoed from minstrels and lutes. Tales of valor and tragedy filled the air. For those brief moments, hierarchy softened. Laughter united lords and servants, and the illusion of equality flickered like firelight. Fragile, but real enough to remember. There were traditions that bound the hall together, small rituals that made the rigid order bearable. The sharing of bread, the passing of a communal cup, the songs sung after supper, all were acts that reminded everyone that even in the shadow of power, they shared the same breath, the same hunger, the same human need for belonging. Yet even those traditions carried risk. A poorly timed jest could insult a superior. A song too melancholy could suggest disloyalty. A servant who stumbled while serving might face a week of punishment. Every movement was under scrutiny, a dance between survival and grace. At the end of the night, when candles melted low and the last cups were drained, the great hall transformed once again. The nobles retired to their chambers, their footsteps echoing down cold corridors. Servants cleared the tables in silence, sweeping crumbs and ashes into the darkness. By dawn, the hall would be immaculate again, as if nothing had happened. The banners would still hang proud, the dais still elevated, the hierarchy restored. The feasts and judgments would begin anew, another day in a world that never stopped performing itself, if one looked closely enough. Though, the great hall revealed the essence of medieval life, a place where appearances ruled, where silence was safety, and where every smile was edged with calculation. And perhaps that was the castle's greatest illusion, that order and civility were signs of peace. In truth, beneath the laughter and ceremony, the castle remained a battlefield, fought not with swords, but with glances, words, and the constant fear of falling from grace. The great hall was not merely a room. It was a mirror reflecting the fragile power that held the medieval world together. Beneath the grandeur of the great hall lay a different world entirely. Down narrow staircases, where the torchlight faded and the air turned heavy, the pulse of the castle beat in shadows. It was here, in these lower chambers, that the true machinery of the medieval fortress clanked, sweated, and whispered. For every noble who dined on silver. There were 20 hands to make it happen, hands that chopped, carried, cleaned, and burned themselves in the process. The kitchens, cellars, and servant corridors were the unseen veins of the castle, and the people who lived there understood the hidden rhythm of its life far better than those seated at the high table. The kitchen was a world unto itself. It was hot, loud, and always in motion. The air shimmered with the heat from open hearths, where spits of meat turned slowly over glowing embers. Iron cauldrons boiled with thick stews, the smell of onion and fat hanging heavy in the air. Servants darted between tables, their arms full of bread, jugs of ale, or baskets of vegetables hauled in from the fields at dawn. At the center of it all stood the head, cook, a figure of authority in their own right. They barked orders like a general on a battlefield, ensuring that no dish left the kitchen unsalted or overcooked. A mistake here wasn't simply culinary failure. It was insult to the Lord's table, a mark of incompetence that could stain one's reputation for life in the storage cellars below. Food was guarded as carefully as gold. Barrels of wine, sacks of flour, and salted meats were rationed according to strict records. Theft, even a handful of grain, was a punishable crime. A clever servant might steal a crust here or there, but the risk was immense. Stories spread of those caught, paraded before their peers, whipped, and dismissed into the cold with nothing but shame. The work never truly ended. At dawn, the fires were lit. By midday, dishes were cleaned and knives sharpened. By night, the kitchen became a place of quiet murmurs, servants sitting on overturned barrels, whispering gossip about the Lord's mood, the lady's new gown, or the knight who drank too much wine at supper. It was in these moments, away from the ears of power, that the castle's true stories lived and breathed. Yet even below the kitchens, deeper still, another kind of world existed, darker and quieter. The castle's underbelly was a maze of stone storerooms, armories, and, in the oldest corners, dungeons. The temperature dropped sharply there, the air damp and smelling faintly of iron and rot. This was the part of the castle few ever saw willingly. The dungeons were built not for comfort, but for control. They were symbols as much as prisons, proof that power had a physical place. Thick wooden doors, reinforced with iron bolts, lined the corridor. Some cells held petty thieves or captured raiders. Others held those who had simply fallen out of favor. A whispered accusation, an unpaid debt, or a rumor of disloyalty could land a person here. Beneath the earth, out of sight and mind, the prisoners endured a silence that was almost alive. The only sounds were the distant echo of footsteps above, or the slow dripping of water from the stone ceiling. Guards moved like ghosts, carrying torches that flickered weakly against the damp walls. Not all castles had torture chambers, but many did. The instruments of fear were kept out of sight, their mere existence enough to keep most in line. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the stocks. These were reminders that the Lord's justice did not end at his word, but extended into the flesh. Still, even the dungeon had its hierarchy. A knight captured in battle might receive a straw mattress, wine, and visits from priests. A peasant accused of stealing grain would lie chained to the wall, fed just enough to survive. Rank followed you even into the dark. Above these depths, the castle's daily life carried on, completely unaware of the whispers rising from below. Children played in the courtyards, priests prayed in chapels, and the lady embroidered by the fire, all while someone beneath their feet counted the hours in silence. Between the kitchen and the dungeon was another important network, the servant passages. These narrow tunnels and staircases twisted through the walls, connecting rooms in ways that nobles rarely noticed. Servants used them to move unseen, carrying water, letters, or trays. They were the castle's secret arteries, hidden routes where gossip flowed faster than any courier. If one wanted to know the truth of a castle, one need only follow a servant's path. They saw everything, which knights stayed too long in the ladies' chambers, which guests whispered after midnight, which noble tore up a letter in fury. Yet, for all they knew, they spoke little. To survive in a castle, silence was not just obedience, it was self-preservation. Life for servants was hard, but strangely proud. They slept in shared quarters, often windowless, sometimes beside the very rooms they tended. Their days were governed by bells, the morning bell for chores, the noon bell for meals, the evening bell for prayers. They rose before the nobles woke and went to bed long after the fires dimmed. Still, among them were small joys. A stolen crust of sweet pastry, a whispered song in the corridor, a brief glance exchanged between a scullery maid and a stable boy. These fleeting moments were rebellion in their own quiet way, a reminder that even under layers of duty and class, people remained human. The guards, too, formed their own invisible society. They patrolled the walls, their armor creaking softly, breath turning to mist in the cold night air. They drank together, swore together, sometimes fought each other, but their loyalty was to the castle first and the lord second. They were the boundary between order and chaos, the embodiment of discipline. Yet, like all men bound by hierarchy, even they whispered their doubts. A guard might question the fairness of a punishment, the cruelty of a command, or the endlessness of their duty. But those thoughts were buried deep, because the walls, they said, had ears. Every brick, every torch, every shadow served a purpose in maintaining control. The castle's order was not just built of stone and wood, but of fear, obedience, and ritual. Still, the castle was not merely a machine of power. It was also a community, fragile, interwoven, and dependent. The cook needed the farmer's produce. The farmer needed the lord's protection. The lord needed the cook's loyalty. Every person, from the dungeon to the dais, played a role in the delicate web that kept the fortress alive on cold nights, when the fires burned low and even the guards nodded at their posts. The castle seemed to breathe, a living organism made of stone and human will. Each chamber had its sound, the creak of a drawbridge, the thud of a knife on wood, the murmur of prayer, the cry from below. Together they formed the heartbeat of a world both magnificent and merciless. It was a system that appeared eternal, unshakable, yet beneath its strength lay fragility. The smallest spark, a discontented servant, a hungry village, a wronged prisoner, could ignite the very foundation it stood on. The castle was safe, but only because everyone believed it to be. And so the hidden rules continued. Obey, observe, endure. The servants served, the guards guarded, the lords ruled. But in the quiet between bells, when the corridors emptied and the fires dimmed, the people who lived in its shadows dreamed of something different, of air that wasn't thick with smoke and fear, of a world where walls didn't define their worth. For all its grandeur, the castle was still a cage. A beautiful one, perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. By night, the castle transformed. The same walls that by day rang with chatter and the clatter of tools became vast and watchful. Torches hissed in their sconces, their flames trembling in the wind that crept through cracks in the mortar. The sound of boots on stone echoed through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly. Somewhere, a hound barked once, then fell silent to outsiders. A castle at night was a symbol of strength, a fortress glowing with the promise of protection. But to those who lived inside, the darkness revealed something else: how fragile the security truly was. Every medieval castle was designed not merely for grandeur, but for survival. It was both home and weapon, a machine of defense. The great outer walls stood thick and silent, built to resist siege engines and fire. Beyond them stretched moats filled with muddy water, often crawling with refuse and rats, but still an obstacle to attackers. Drawbridges were lifted each evening, their heavy chains creaking, leaving the world outside sealed away until morning. From the battlements, the guards kept their eternal vigil. Cloaked against the cold, they moved between towers, lanterns swinging in their hands. Below, the countryside stretched dark and formless, the faint glow of distant villages marking the edge of the Lord's reach. The guards knew that danger did not always come with banners and swords. Sometimes it crept quietly in the form of famine, rumor, or betrayal. Inside, the castle's defenses went far beyond walls and weapons. There were rules, invisible ones, etched into the rhythm of life. A servant never entered the Lord's private chambers unannounced. A guard never spoke of what he saw in the dungeon. A messenger never read the letters he carried. These unspoken laws were what truly kept the order intact. Beneath the stones, there were other forms of defense. Secret tunnels carved in times of crisis. Some led to nearby forests or rivers, escape routes for the Lord and his family should the walls be breached. They were narrow and suffocating, the air stale and thick with dust. Only a few trusted men knew their location. To reveal one was treason. To misuse it was death. Old masons whispered that they had built passages even the Lord did not know about. Hidden compartments behind fireplaces, false walls within chapels, stairways that led nowhere. Some said these were mistakes. Others said they were safety nets, built by men who understood that even the mightiest fortress could fall. The very architecture of the castle reflected paranoia. Arrow slits allowed defenders to fire unseen. Spiral staircases twisted clockwise so that a right-handed attacker would struggle to swing his sword. Every feature was designed to remind intruders and inhabitants alike that the castle's mind was as sharp as its stone. But not every enemy came from outside. The greatest threat often came from within. A lord's reign depended not only on his armies, but on the loyalty of those who shared his walls. One whisper could undo years of command. One disloyal servant could turn a feast into a funeral. Trust, therefore, was a rare commodity, as precious as gold, and twice as fragile. For this reason, suspicion became part of castle life. Servants were watched, guards were tested, letters were sealed with wax that bore not just the Lord's emblem, but his paranoia. Some rulers even employed listeners, servants who eavesdropped on others and reported what they heard. In these silent wars of loyalty, truth became as slippery as oil. There was a strange irony in it all. The higher one climbed in status, the less freedom one possessed. The lord and lady were surrounded by luxury, yet every glance, every word carried weight. They could command hundreds, but could never speak openly. They were trapped in their own performance, bound by etiquette, religion, and fear of scandal. The walls protected them from armies, but not from rumors, and still, life went on. Each morning, the castle woke again, as if none of this quiet tension existed. The cook shouted orders, the blacksmith hammered iron, The priest prayed in the chapel, and children played in the courtyard. To the casual eye, it was a well-oiled world of harmony. But underneath, invisible cracks ran deep. There were those who dreamed of escape. A servant who gazed at the forest beyond the gatehouse and imagined a life without bells or masters. A guard who thought of desertion, tired of standing on the battlements through endless winters. A lady who looked down from her tower window and wondered what it would be like to walk barefoot through mud again, nameless and free, yet few ever left. Because beyond those walls lay uncertainty, hunger, bandits, the plague. Within them lay structure, food, and the illusion of belonging. The castle did not merely imprison its people, it convinced them they could not live without it. Still, there were moments when the illusion wavered. A failed harvest could spark unrest. A noble's cruelty could stir rebellion. A guard's misstep could ignite suspicion that spread like wildfire. The same walls that had kept danger out could just as easily keep it in, trapping everyone inside with their fear. When revolts did come, they were swift and terrible. Fires licking at banners, the clang of steel against stone, shouts echoing through corridors once filled with laughter. The tapestries that once displayed glory now absorbed the smoke of ruin. Many castles fell not from siege, but from betrayal, from hands that had once served faithfully. And yet, for every castle that crumbled, another was built. The same cycle began again, stone upon stone, rule upon rule, until obedience felt as natural as breathing. By the 14th century, many castles were evolving. The old fortresses of pure defense began to soften into palaces of prestige. Glass windows appeared where arrow slits once were. Gardens bloomed where moats had stood. Lords began to value display as much as defense. But the essence remained unchanged. Control disguised as civilization. Even the art that adorned the walls, tapestries, mosaics, paintings, carried messages of power. They depicted victories, saints, and genealogies that proved divine right. Every color, every emblem reinforced the hierarchy. A castle was not merely a building. It was propaganda in stone. At night, when the fires burned low, the castle's silence became almost sentient. Some said you could hear the walls breathing, or the faint weeping of ghosts who had died defending it. But perhaps the real ghosts were the lives swallowed by duty, men and women whose names never appeared in chronicles, whose sweat darkened the stones but whose voices never reached the world beyond. Still, their presence lingered in the worn steps of the staircases, in the soot on the chimney, in the grooves of the great door's hinges. Every mark on the stone was a memory, a story that the castle held tight. For the people who lived there, survival meant more than food and shelter. It meant learning the language of power, when to speak, when to kneel, when to remain invisible. It meant mastering the art of endurance, finding small fragments of freedom in a life bound by ritual. And so, the hidden rules continued, silent, ancient, and unspoken. They passed from generation to generation, from master to servant, from builder to heir. Each castle had its own variations, but the essence never changed. Control, order, and the illusion of permanence. But history has shown that no wall lasts forever. Even the strongest fortresses crumble, their stones scattered and repurposed. The great halls turn to ruins, their tapestries to dust. Yet somehow, the idea of the castle endures, not as stone, but as symbol. The idea that safety requires obedience, that walls equal peace, that control equals order, And maybe that is the greatest hidden rule of all, that we continue to build walls, long after the last castle has fallen. By the dawn of the late Middle Ages, the castle was beginning to lose its grip on the world it had once dominated. The clang of forges and the thunder of hooves that had filled its courtyards were fading. In their place came something quieter but no less powerful change. The walls that had seemed eternal now looked weary. The moat, once a symbol of impenetrable defense, stagnated, filled with reeds and the ghosts of forgotten battles. The very stones seemed to sigh under the weight of centuries of obedience and fear. The age of the castle, the fortress lord, the rigid hierarchy, the constant readiness for siege was slipping away. It did not happen suddenly. The change came softly, almost imperceptibly, carried by whispers, inventions, and shifting loyalties. Gunpowder began to alter warfare. Cannons could tear through the thickest walls in a matter of hours, rendering once invincible fortresses vulnerable. The sword, which had once defined a noble's worth, began to feel like a relic. The balance of power was changing, and no wall could keep it out. Lords who had built their identities around stone and steel now faced a new reality. To survive, they adapted. Some abandoned their ancestral strongholds altogether, building new manor houses, less defensible, but far more comfortable. Windows grew larger. Curtains replaced portcullises. Laughter echoed where once there had only been commands. But not everyone left. Some clung to the old ways, refusing to believe that the world beyond their battlements was changing. They kept their guards posted, their drawbridges raised, and their halls cold and echoing. They told themselves that the castle still mattered, that stone meant safety. Yet, even as they did, the very world outside their gates was learning to live without them. Trade was flourishing. Cities were rising. The center of power was shifting from land to commerce. The merchant, not the knight, was becoming the face of the new age. And in this new rhythm of life, the castle's rules, silence, obedience, isolation began to feel like chains. For the peasants and servants who had spent their lives in the shadow of those towers, change was both terrifying and liberating. Some left to seek work in towns, carrying with them the habits they had learned within those walls: deference, caution, endurance. Even beyond the castle, they still bowed their heads to those above them, still waited for permission before speaking. The walls had shaped them in ways that no freedom could easily undo, and yet something remarkable began to stir. A slow awakening. In the towns that spread like vines across Europe, people began to question the divine order that had governed them for centuries. If a man could earn wealth by trade, if a woman could sell cloth or candles and feed her family without a lord's permission, then perhaps the world was not as fixed as they had been told. The castles began to stand as reminders, not of power, but of the cost of it inside their abandoned chambers. The wind played with tattered banners and broken furniture. The echo of prayers still lingered in the chapels, the faint scent of iron in the armory. In the kitchens, rusted cauldrons sat where once fires had roared day and night. Mice scurried through what had been treasure rooms. The silence that once meant safety now sounded like decay, and yet the castle's shadow did not fade completely. Its influence remained woven into the very fabric of European life. The architecture of authority, the need for order, for rank, for walls between ruler and ruled, persisted. You could see it in the grand manners of the Renaissance, in the palaces of kings, in the bureaucracies of empires yet to come. The castle had taught humanity how to build power and how to fear it. Even centuries later, When travelers wandered among the ruins, they could feel the presence of those who had lived and died within them. The air carried whispers of cooks and soldiers, of noble women and priests. Every step across the moss-covered stones seemed to awaken something ancient, a lesson carved in silence. And that lesson was simple, though easily forgotten. Power is never only about strength. It is about control, about who gets to speak, who must kneel, and who was allowed to dream. The hidden rules of the medieval castle had not truly disappeared. They had only changed shape. Where once they were enforced by knights and lords, they were now maintained by laws, wealth, and institutions. The castle had taught the world that hierarchy could be built anywhere, not just in stone, but in the human mind. Still, the ruins stood, against the grey skies and green hills. They looked almost alive, skeletal reminders of a world that had once believed it could last forever. Travelers would come to gaze at them, to marvel at their craftsmanship, to imagine what life had been like when banners still flew from their towers. They would picture feasts in great halls, or brave knights defending their gates, or fair maidens gazing from balconies. But few would imagine the real truth, the fear of punishment, the cold hunger of servants, the weight of silence in the corridors. Few would see how much of the castle was built not of stone, but of obedience. In the end, that is the paradox of the medieval castle. It was both sanctuary and prison, symbol of progress and relic of control. It protected its people, but it also bound them. It inspired awe, yet demanded submission. And even as its stones crumble, its echoes live on in every place, where walls still separate the powerful from the powerless. As the last rays of the sun fade behind a broken tower, the castle stands, half ruin, half memory, a monument not just to an age, but to an idea that refuses to die. The idea that safety and freedom can never fully coexist. That power, once built, never truly lets go. And as the night wind sweeps through the hollow corridors, carrying with it the sound of rustling leaves and distant bells, one can almost hear the faint voices of the past, whispering the rules that once ruled the world. Even after the last torches went out and ivy swallowed the stone, the medieval castle refused to vanish from memory. It lingered, not as a ruin, but as a presence. For centuries, people told stories about those who had lived behind its walls. Some were romantic tales of knights and queens. Others were darker, steeped in blood and regret. Both kinds served the same purpose, to keep the castle alive in the imagination. When the world around them changed, when cities became the new centers of life and trade, the memory of the castle still stood like a ghost in the minds of the people. Children were told stories of noble lords and damsels in distress. Artists painted visions of gleaming halls, tapestries, and banquets. Poets described moonlit towers and gallant love. But beneath those romantic images, the real essence of the castle, its discipline, its structure, its control still shaped how people thought about authority, family, and faith. It is remarkable how easily the invisible walls of a system outlast the physical ones. The medieval castle had been a world of boundaries, upstairs and downstairs, noble and servant, man and woman, sinner and priest. Those divisions did not crumble when the towers fell. They adapted. You could see them in every household where the master's word was law, in every village where obedience was expected more than understanding, in every mind that believed some were born to rule and others to serve. That was the true triumph of the castle, not its stones. but its ideas in the Renaissance. Kings built palaces that were far grander and more beautiful than any feudal fortress. But their foundations were still the same. The corridors were filled with courtiers instead of knights. The intrigues were whispered in silks instead of armor, yet the rules had not changed. Deference, loyalty, and silence still guarded the corridors of power. The architecture of control simply traded its cold stone for marble, and beyond the palaces. The common people still carried the castle in their bones. The habits of obedience and survival were inherited like family heirlooms. The servant might no longer sleep in a drafty corner of a keep, but he still bowed to authority, still feared hunger, still measured every word before speaking. Generations later, when empires rose and fell, when industrial machines replaced swords and plows, the rhythm of command and submission remained eerily familiar. Even religion, once so deeply entwined with the castle's rule, evolved without losing that ancient structure of hierarchy. Bishops replaced chaplains, and cathedrals rose in place of chapels. But the same order prevailed. There were those who spoke for God and those who simply listened. It was the castle's echo, transformed into spiritual architecture. Yet, for all its rigidity, something deeply human also survived from those times. The longing for belonging, for purpose, for safety within walls. People remembered the castle not just as a symbol of oppression, but also as a place of identity. Within those walls, everyone had a role, a duty, a rhythm. Life was harsh, but it was known. There was comfort in knowing where one stood, even if it was at the bottom. And so, even as centuries passed, the allure of the castle persisted. It appeared in the romances of the Victorians, in the tales of Arthurian legends, in the paintings of misty battlements overlooking valleys. It became less about power and more about nostalgia, a yearning for a simpler, ordered world that perhaps never truly existed. The irony is that the very people who romanticized castles the most were those who would never have survived within them. The poets who dreamed of gallant knights would have been crushed by the castle's silence. The painters who depicted elegant feasts would have starved in its kitchens. But imagination has always been kinder than history. Still, the ruins themselves hold a truth that words cannot fully erase. When you walk through the crumbling gate of a medieval castle today, you can feel it, a heaviness in the air, as though the stones themselves remember. You can almost hear the echo of footsteps on the stair, the clatter of armor, the murmur of prayers. You can sense the invisible structure that once governed every breath taken within those walls. It is said that the past never truly dies. It merely changes form. And in many ways, we are still living under the castle's shadow. We still build walls, not from stone, but from systems, routines, and fears. We still rank and divide. We still look for leaders to protect us. And we still yield freedom in exchange for safety. The castle, for all its cruelty, was built from a very human desire, the need to feel secure in a dangerous world. That need has never left us. It has only evolved from drawbridges and moats to locked doors and digital passwords, from watchtowers to surveillance cameras, from kings to corporations. The names change. The instinct remains. If you look closely at modern society, at the offices, the politics, the hierarchies of power, you can trace their lineage back to those cold stone halls. The way we organize authority, the way we obey laws, the way we define order, it all carries the genetic memory of a world that believed walls could solve fear, and maybe, in a strange way, that's why we still find castles so hauntingly beautiful. They represent both our greatest ingenuity and our deepest insecurity. They remind us that civilization was not built on freedom alone, but on control, and that both can coexist only uneasily. The hidden rules of the medieval castle were never just about discipline. They were about understanding humanity's double-edged nature, our yearning for safety and our instinct for power. The walls kept enemies out, but they also kept people in, and perhaps that balance, that eternal tug-of-war between freedom and fear, is what keeps history repeating itself. So when you stand before a ruined tower, staring up at what remains of its strength, you are not merely looking at history. You are looking at a mirror, a reflection of what humanity once was, and what it still is, a species that builds walls, both to protect and to imprison itself. The stones may be silent now, but they still whisper their warning. Power and safety are never free. Every fortress demands its price. If the stones of a medieval castle could speak, they wouldn't tell tales of kings or battles first. They would speak of people, the quiet souls who lived and died beneath its cold gaze. The servants who scrubbed the same floor every morning, the children who grew up in its courtyards, never knowing a life beyond the gates, the soldiers who stood watch in endless winters. It was not just a structure of power. It was a world of emotions, both whispered and unspoken. Every corridor carried memories of exhaustion, devotion, love, and fear. The rules of the castle were carved not only in law, but into the hearts of its people. For the Lord, obedience meant order. For the servant, obedience meant survival. Every role carried a burden, and every heart learned to beat in rhythm with the toll of the chapel bell at dawn. The castle stirred like a living thing. The kitchen would already be alive, with clatter, cauldrons bubbling over hearths, servants moving quickly under the eye of the cook, whose temper could rise faster than the flames. Bread baked for the Lord's table, but also for the soldiers on the ramparts. Every loaf had a destination, every task a silent rule attached to it. To delay, to speak out of turn, to make a mistake, all could mean punishment. And yet, amidst the fear, there was also a strange comfort in the rhythm, in knowing one's place. For many who lived within those walls, the castle was both prison and home. A boy born into servitude might never see beyond its gates, yet he would know every stone, every stair, every echo of his own footsteps. It became his world, vast in its narrowness, familiar in its confinement. And sometimes, that familiarity was enough to feel safe. Up in the great hall, the lords and ladies played their own games of survival. Theirs were battles of words, alliances, and appearances. A single misplaced glance during a feast could sow suspicion. A whispered rumor could ruin a family. Even the most powerful woman in the castle, the lady of the house, was bound by invisible chains of duty and expectation. Her beauty and grace were her armor, her silence, her shield. She could command servants, but she herself was often powerless before the will of her husband or king. And yet, within these quiet restrictions, small rebellions flickered like candlelight. A servant who pocketed a crust of bread, a squire who dreamed of knighthood, a maid who fell in love with a man far above her station. The castle's rules could dictate behavior, but not the soul. Human desire, after all, is the one thing even stone cannot contain. Love inside a castle was both precious and dangerous. It had to live in the shadows, a stolen glance across the courtyard, a letter hidden in a tapestry, a whispered confession by torchlight. Sometimes love was arranged, a tool for alliance. Sometimes it was forbidden, a secret strong enough to destroy lives. But always, it reminded those who lived within the walls that they were still human, even in a world designed to suppress emotion. And for the knights, those shining symbols of honor, life was far less romantic than the legends suggest. They lived by codes that demanded courage and loyalty but offered little peace. Many of them carried the weight of blood on their hands, their glory built upon violence. When they returned from battle, their armor gleamed, but their eyes carried the emptiness of men who had seen too much. To die with honor was expected. To live with guilt was the unspoken price. The priests who resided within the castle had their own burdens. Their task was to maintain faith among the people, but in private, they wrestled with questions that could never be spoken aloud. They saw the hypocrisy of power cloaked in piety. The same Lord who prayed in the morning could order executions by afternoon. Yet the priest could only counsel obedience, for defiance was sin. Even faith, within those walls, was bound by politics. But the castle also carried moments of grace. A nurse tending to a feverish child, a musician playing a lute in the courtyard after sunset, a cook slipping an extra slice of meat to a hungry boy. These small acts of kindness defied the castle's cold order. They reminded everyone from lord to peasant that beneath the rules, the hierarchies, and the fear, there still beat the fragile pulse of humanity. Over time, even as the castle began to crumble, those human stories endured. The physical walls might have fallen, but the emotions they sheltered continued to echo through the generations. We still tell those stories of knights and servants, of forbidden love, of loyalty and betrayal, because they are our stories, too. The stage has changed, but the play remains the same. Modern life is not so different from the medieval castle. Our workplaces, governments, and social circles have their own invisible hierarchies, their own unspoken expectations. We still measure power in influence, obedience in silence, and loyalty in sacrifice. The titles may have changed, but the structure is hauntingly familiar. Perhaps this is why the image of a medieval castle feels both alien and intimate. It reminds us of what we've built and what we've never escaped. It stands as both a monument to human achievement and a warning of human nature. As twilight falls over a ruined castle today, you can almost imagine the faint outlines of its former life. The distant echo of a horn, the creak of a drawbridge, the soft, tired sigh of a maid finishing her chores, the flicker of a torch in the wind. The castle sleeps, but its stories never do. They live on in the human need to remember, to understand, and to belong even to a past that was as cruel as it was magnificent. And perhaps that is the castle's final rule, the one it still enforces centuries later. To build walls is easy. To live freely beyond them is the real challenge. As the centuries passed, the mighty castles that once defined power and dominance slowly began to lose their purpose. The clang of steel grew faint, the banners faded, and the great halls that once echoed with command fell into silence. But even as time stripped away their grandeur, something lingered in the air. The invisible presence of the lives that once filled them. The hidden rules of those castles did not die with the stones. They seeped into the foundations of our societies, reshaping how we live, think, and obey. Imagine walking through one of those ancient ruins today. The cold wind brushes against your face as you step into the remains of the Great Hall. Dust floats in the sunlight, streaming through a cracked window. Your footsteps echo off the empty walls, and for a moment, you can almost hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of boots, the faint laughter of servants, the low tones of a nobleman discussing his next campaign. The air feels heavy, as though it remembers. You realize that you are standing inside a memory, one carved not only into stone, but into the very way. Humans have learned to build societies. Every wall in a medieval castle was designed to enforce control. The hierarchy was not an accident. It was architecture made social. The Lord's chambers were always above the Great Hall, a physical reminder that power, quite literally, looked down upon the rest. The servants' quarters, cold and narrow, sat deep in the lower levels, where sunlight barely reached. Even the spiral staircases twisted clockwise so that a right-handed defender could swing his sword with ease, while an intruder would struggle. Every detail served a purpose. Every structure spoke a silent command. Order must be preserved, and everyone must know their place. And yet, even as centuries rolled on, we never truly dismantled that order. The castle's influence continued, invisible, refined, and disguised. Today, our cities rise where castles once stood, made of glass and steel instead of limestone, but the rules feel hauntingly familiar. We still build higher for those with more power, still separate the privileged from the poor, still construct systems designed to keep balance or illusion in check. The same walls exist, only now they are metaphorical. The medieval castle was not merely a fortress of defense, it was a fortress of the mind. It shaped behavior through architecture and fear, through duty and expectation. Servants didn't just obey because they had to. They obeyed because they were taught to believe it was their natural role. Knights didn't just fight for glory, they fought because honor demanded it. And the lords who ruled didn't always rule from cruelty, often. They too were prisoners of the system, trapped within the expectations of lineage and reputation. Power, after all, is its own kind of confinement. As dusk settles over the ruins, you can feel this weight in the silence. The castle may be broken, but its presence is not dead. The tower, jagged against the fading light, still casts a shadow, long and reaching, stretching through history, touching everything that came after. Perhaps that's why these ruins fascinate us. They're not just relics of stone. They are mirrors, showing us where we've come from and what we still carry inside those stone walls. Generations lived entire lives without ever questioning their place. The cook's apprentice who dreamed of freedom never left. The chambermaid who fell in love with a guard was forced to silence. The young lord who envied his father's authority grew into the same kind of ruler. The castle's greatest power was not its armies or its walls, but its ability to make people accept their roles, willingly or not. But among all the obedience, something else survived: resilience. Even within oppression, there were sparks of defiance, moments of tenderness, and flashes of courage. A servant singing while cleaning the floor, a knight sharing food with a beggar, a woman daring to speak her truth. These were quiet revolutions, invisible to history books, but loud in meaning. They remind us that no matter how rigid a system becomes, the human spirit always finds cracks to grow through. And now, when we gaze at those ruined towers, we are really looking at the blueprint of civilization. The medieval castle was humanity's experiment in order, fear, loyalty, and faith. It showed how far we'd go to protect what we owned, and how much we'd surrender to feel protected. Every moat dug, every wall raised, was built from the same impulse that still drives us today. The desire for control in a world of uncertainty. The irony, of course, is that the stronger the walls became, the less free the people inside them were. That is the secret truth buried beneath the castle's grandeur. The lord was as confined by duty as the servant was by labor. Power brought isolation, just as submission brought exhaustion. The entire system depended on the illusion that someone, somewhere, was truly safe behind those walls. But no one was. The castle was never freedom. It was a beautifully constructed cage. And maybe that's why, centuries later, these ruins continue to move us. Standing before a broken keep or walking through an abandoned hall, we are reminded that all our walls, literal or invisible, eventually crumble. The towers we build of wealth, status, or fear cannot outlast the tides of time, but the stories can. The lessons can. The echo of what those people endured still speaks softly through the stones. So when you see a medieval castle today, don't just think of knights and kings. Think of the countless lives lived beneath them, the hands that built the stones, the hearts that broke behind them, the rules that bound them all. Each castle was a world, complete in its cruelty and beauty, its order and chaos. And each ruin you see now is a reminder. The systems we build to control others eventually end up controlling us. The hidden rules of the medieval castle were never truly forgotten. They live on in every hierarchy, in every unspoken expectation, in every place where power is unevenly divided. The castles may have fallen, but their design, both architectural and psychological, remains within us. That is their true legacy. As you leave the ruins, the wind catches your breath. You glance back once more at the silhouette of the fortress against the fading sky. For a brief moment, it almost feels alive, breathing with the weight of history. The last light of day brushes the highest tower, and you realize that what once stood for dominance now stands for remembrance. The castle no longer commands, it warns. It tells us that every empire, every structure, every rule, no matter how absolute, will one day turn to dust. But the human spirit, in all its frailty and defiance, will always find its way through the cracks. And so the story of the medieval castle ends not with a conquest, but with a whisper that true strength lies not in walls, but in the courage to live without them.